I never thought silence could feel this heavy. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as I set 2 cups on the counter. One for me, one for David. It had been 3 months since his father passed. 3 months since my son moved back into our family home temporarily to help me through the grief. But somewhere between the funeral flowers wilting and the sympathy cards gathering dust, something had shifted in my boy. Something I couldn't quite name yet. I poured the coffee, dark roast, the way Harold used to like it, the way I still made it out of habit, and waited. David's footsteps echoed from upstairs, deliberate and distant. When he appeared in the doorway, he was already dressed for work, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, sliding his cup across the counter. "I was thinking we could go through Dad's office today. There are still some papers." "Mom." His voice cut through my words like a door slamming shut. "We need to talk." Something cold settled in my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The same tone he'd used when he was 16 and had crashed the car. The same careful distance in his eyes when he'd told me about his divorce 2 years ago. I knew this voice. It was the voice of someone about to deliver bad news while protecting themselves from the mess it would create. He didn't touch the coffee. Instead, he pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then placed it face down on the counter between us like evidence in a trial I didn't know I was attending. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, and already I hated how he said "your situation," as if my grief was a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be tended. "This house is too big for one person. The maintenance, the property taxes, the memories. It's not healthy for you to rattle around in here alone." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, seeking its warmth. "David, this is my home. Your father and I built a life here. We raised you here. I'm not ready to—" "Mom, listen to me." He leaned forward, and for a moment, I saw the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "I've found a wonderful assisted living community just 20 minutes away. They have gardens, activities, other people your age. You'd have your own apartment, but with support when you need it. It's perfect for someone in your stage of life." Stage of life. As if being 68 and widowed automatically moved me into some waiting room for the end. As if I was already halfway gone and just didn't know it yet. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," I said quietly. "And this house." He sighed, the kind of long-suffering exhale that made me feel like a difficult child. "Mom, be realistic. When was the last time you had the gutters cleaned? The furnace serviced? Dad handled all of that, and now, look, I'm trying to help you here. This place is falling apart." I looked around the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, where I'd helped him with homework at the worn wooden table, where Harold and I had shared our last cup of coffee together on a Tuesday morning in February. The walls might need fresh paint, and yes, there was that persistent drip in the upstairs bathroom, but falling apart? This house was filled with life, with memory, with love that had seeped into the very foundation. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? Besides, David continued, straightening his tie again, a nervous habit he'd developed during his divorce proceedings. "Amanda and I have been talking about expanding our family. We're going to need more space, and with housing prices the way they are," he trailed off, but the implication hung between us like smoke. Ah, there it was. The real reason behind this sudden concern for my well-being. My son and his new wife needed a bigger house, and here sat this perfectly good 4-bedroom home with just one aging woman rattling around inside it like a pea in a pod. How inefficient. How wasteful. "This is my home, David," I repeated, and my voice sounded smaller than I'd intended. "Your father and I—" "Dad is gone, Mom." The words hit like a physical blow. "He's been gone for 3 months, and you can't keep living in the past. You can't keep this house like some kind of shrine." I set my coffee down carefully, afraid my hands might shake. Through the window, I could see the garden where Harold had planted roses for our 30th anniversary. They needed pruning, but they were still blooming. Hardy things that knew how to survive even after the gardener was gone. "I need time," I said finally. "This is a big decision, and I can't just—" David checked his watch. "Look, I have to get to work, but we'll talk more about this tonight. I've already scheduled a tour of Sunset Manor for Thursday. Just to look, okay? Just to see what's available." He kissed my forehead quickly, the way you might pat a dog, and headed for the door. I heard his car start, heard him drive away, leaving me alone with 2 cups of coffee and the slowly dawning realization that my son had stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as an obstacle to his future. That evening, when David returned from work, he was different, purposeful, determined. He'd brought Amanda with him, a petite blonde with earnest eyes who spoke in the gentle, patronizing tone usually reserved for children and the elderly. "Mrs. Henderson," Amanda said, settling into Harold's favorite armchair without asking, a small presumption that felt like a slap. "David has told me so much about you. We're both so concerned about you living here all alone." Mrs. Henderson, not Margaret, not Mom, not even David's mother, just Mrs. Henderson, as if I was a neighbor they barely knew instead of the woman who'd given birth to her husband, who'd raised him, who'd held him through every fever and heartbreak of his first 25 years. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine." David and Amanda exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that married couples have, full of raised eyebrows and subtle head tilts. I recognized it because Harold and I used to do the same thing, though never about his mother, never about anyone we were supposed to love unconditionally. "Mom," David said, and there was a new firmness in his voice, the tone of a parent speaking to a stubborn child. "We drove by Sunset Manor on our way here. It's beautiful. Professional landscaping, a lovely lobby, and they have a waiting list. If we don't act soon—" "You drove by without me?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, revealing the hurt I was trying so hard to hide. "You're making plans about my life without including me?" Amanda leaned forward with practiced empathy. "We just wanted to make sure it was worth your time before we asked you to visit. We know how difficult this transition must be for you." Transition. As if my entire life was just a phase to be managed, a problem to be solved with the right paperwork and monthly payments. I wanted to tell them that this wasn't a transition. This was my home being taken from me, my independence being questioned, my choices being made by people who saw me as a burden rather than a person. Instead, I said, "I haven't agreed to any transition." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken frustration. David rubbed his forehead, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it made my chest ache. But where Harold's version had been thoughtful, contemplative, David's felt impatient, annoyed. "Look, Mom," he said finally, "I know this is hard, but you have to understand. Amanda and I are starting our life together. We need space for the family we're planning. And honestly, it makes sense for everyone. You get the care and community you need, and you get my house," I finished quietly. Amanda's cheeks flushed pink. "It's not like that, Mrs. Henderson. We're thinking about what's best for everyone involved." "Are you?" I asked. And for the first time that evening, my voice carried some steel. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're thinking about what's most convenient for you." David stood abruptly, his patience finally fraying. "Mom, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to help you here. By taking my home? By giving you a better option." The words came out louder than he'd intended, and for a moment, we both stared at each other in shock. This was David, my gentle boy who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar at age 6, who'd never raised his voice to me even during the worst of his teenage years. He ran his hand through his hair, looking suddenly younger. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Look, can we just go see the place? Just look? What harm could that do?" I wanted to tell him that looking was the first step toward leaving, that agreeing to tour Sunset Manor was agreeing to the possibility of abandoning everything Harold and I had built together. But my son was staring at me with such pleading in his eyes that were Harold's eyes, the same warm brown that had looked at me with love for 37 years. "All right," I said finally. "I'll look, but I'm not promising anything else." The relief on their faces was so obvious it was almost insulting. They'd gotten what they came for, my compliance, wrapped up as compromise. Amanda actually clapped her hands together, as if I'd just agreed to something wonderful instead of considering the dismantling of my entire existence. Over the next few weeks, the visits became a pattern. David would come by after work, sometimes with Amanda, sometimes alone, and each time the conversation somehow circled back to Sunset Manor, to my situation, to what was best for everyone involved. The language was always gentle, caring, but underneath it was an assumption that had never been spoken aloud, that my preferences, my feelings, my deep attachment to this house were obstacles to be overcome rather than considerations to be respected. They started bringing brochures, glossy pamphlets full of smiling elderly people engaged in pottery classes and garden walks, looking fulfilled in ways that seemed both artificial and vaguely threatening. "Look, Mom," David would say, spreading the colorful pages across my kitchen table. "They have book clubs and movie nights, and there's even a salon where you can get your hair done." As if I couldn't read books in my own house, couldn't watch movies in my own living room, couldn't drive myself to my own hair salon where I'd been going for 15 years, and where Marie knew exactly how I liked my cut without me having to explain it to strangers who saw me as just another elderly woman in need of managing. The most painful part was how carefully they avoided acknowledging what this really was. They never said, "We want your house." They never said, "You're inconvenient." Instead, they wrapped their desire in concern, their impatience in love, their plans in what they insisted was my own best interest. And I began to wonder if this was how it happened, if this was how children convinced themselves that abandoning their parents was actually kindness, if this was how love got redefined as efficiency, how care became management, how a lifetime of sacrifice was repaid with gentle, implacable pressure to get out of the way. Thursday came faster than I wanted it to. David picked me up at 10 in the morning, his freshly washed car smelling of the pine air freshener that Amanda preferred, another small erasure of the familiar scents that used to fill our family vehicles. The drive to Sunset Manor was quiet except for the GPS directions and David's occasional comments about traffic or weather, safe topics that wouldn't lead to arguments or tears. When we pulled into the circular driveway, I had to admit the place was beautiful in an antiseptic, catalog-perfect way. Manicured lawns, professional landscaping, a facade that managed to look both elegant and institutional. A discreet sign announced, "Sunset Manor, a community of care," in serif font that was probably focus grouped to convey both sophistication and warmth. But as I stepped out of the car, breathing in air that smelled of nothing in particular, no roses from Harold's garden, no lilacs from the tree we'd planted when David started kindergarten, no familiar mixture of home and memory, I felt something inside me shift, not breaking exactly, but hardening, like water turning to ice, expanding as it changed into something that could no longer be shaped by gentle pressure alone. "Ready, Mom?" David asked, offering me his arm with the kind of solicitous care usually reserved for invalids. I looked at him, really looked, and saw a stranger wearing my son's face, someone who'd learned to smile while planning my exile, who'd mastered the art of loving me just enough to make his betrayal feel like kindness. "Yes," I said, taking his arm because refusing would only delay the inevitable. "Let's get this over with." The tour guide was a woman named Jennifer with the kind of aggressively cheerful demeanor that made me suspect she'd practiced this speech hundreds of times before. She wore a powder blue blazer and sensible shoes, her smile so bright it seemed to have its own power source. "Welcome to Sunset Manor," she chirped as we entered the lobby. "I'm so excited to show you around our beautiful community. You're going to absolutely love it here, Mrs. Henderson." The lobby was exactly what you'd expect. Marble floors that clicked under our feet, leather furniture arranged in conversation groups that looked like they'd never hosted an actual conversation, and fresh flowers that were probably replaced twice a week whether they needed it or not. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, the kind of bland instrumental arrangements designed to soothe without actually engaging anyone's emotions. "Now, Mrs. Henderson," Jennifer continued, clipboard in hand like a weapon of efficiency, "David has told me so much about you. He mentioned that you've been living alone since your husband's passing and that you're ready for a change." Ready for a change. I glanced at David, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. When had I said I was ready for anything except to be left alone in my own home? "Let's start with our common areas," Jennifer said, leading us down a hallway lined with watercolor paintings of flowers that could have been purchased by the dozen from any hotel supply catalog. "This is our library. We have over 3,000 books, and our residents love our weekly book discussions." The library was pleasant enough, I supposed. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that looked suspiciously pristine, as if they were more for decoration than reading. A few elderly people sat in armchairs, but they weren't reading. They were staring out the windows, or dozing with books open on their laps like props in a play about contentment. "And this is our activity room," Jennifer continued, her enthusiasm never wavering. "We have art classes, bingo, movie nights, and dance socials every Friday. There's always something fun happening at Sunset Manor. Fun. The word felt foreign in this context. The activity room was filled with round tables and folding chairs, everything designed for easy cleaning and maximum efficiency. A bulletin board displayed a schedule of events that read like a summer camp for seniors. Watercolor Wednesday, Trivia Thursday, Fitness Friday, as if aging meant regressing to childhood, where your days needed to be structured by someone else and your entertainment spoon-fed in digestible portions. "Mom, look at this," David said, pointing to a group of women working on what appeared to be a jigsaw puzzle. "Doesn't that look nice? Social activities with people your own age. People my own age." As if age was the only thing that mattered in friendship. As if I should be grateful for any companionship as long as the participants were born within the same decade. I thought of my neighbor Helen, who was 15 years younger but understood my sense of humor better than anyone. I thought of Marcus, the young father next door who always waved when he saw me gardening and sometimes brought his toddler over to see the flowers. Age had never been the defining factor in any relationship I'd valued. "And here's our dining room," Jennifer announced, leading us into a space that looked like a hotel restaurant, all neutral colors and practical furniture designed to accommodate wheelchairs and walkers. "We have 3 meals a day prepared by our professional kitchen staff, plus snacks available all day. No more worrying about grocery shopping or cooking. No more cooking." As if preparing meals was a burden rather than one of the last creative acts left to me, one of the few ways I still felt useful and productive. I thought of my kitchen at home, where I knew exactly which burner heated fastest and which spice rack held what I needed without looking, where I could make Harold's favorite pot roast from memory, or try a new recipe I'd clipped from a magazine, or bake cookies for the mailman who always took an extra moment to ask how I was doing. "The menu rotates every 2 weeks," Jennifer continued, "and we accommodate all dietary restrictions. Our residents just love not having to think about meal planning anymore. Not having to think." There it was again. This assumption that thinking, planning, making choices was something to be relieved of rather than preserved. That independence was a burden to be lifted rather than a dignity to be maintained. We toured a model apartment, a tidy one-bedroom space that managed to feel both cramped and sterile despite its adequate square footage. Everything was beige and burgundy, colors chosen by committee to offend no one and inspire no one either. The kitchenette had a mini refrigerator and a microwave, as if residents might be trusted with simple reheating but nothing that required actual cooking skills. "Of course you'd bring your own furniture," Jennifer explained, though the space was so small that most of my lifetime's accumulation of meaningful objects would have to be abandoned. Many of our residents find this as a perfect opportunity to downsize and simplify their lives. Simplify. Another euphemism for loss, for giving up, for accepting that the life you'd built over decades was too complicated for your diminished capacity to handle. "Where would I put my piano?" I asked, thinking of the old upright that had been my mother's, where I still played hymns on Sunday mornings and Christmas carols in December. Jennifer's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, our activity room has a lovely piano that residents are welcome to use during designated hours." Designated hours. I couldn't play my mother's piano whenever the mood struck me. Couldn't sit down at 11 o'clock at night when insomnia hit and work through a piece that reminded me of better times. I'd have to schedule my music, request permission for the simple comfort of familiar keys under my fingers. "And what about pets?" I asked, though I didn't have any. But Harold and I had always talked about getting a cat when he retired, and the question seemed important somehow. "We have a visiting therapy dog program," Jennifer replied with the same cheerful tone. "Residents love the weekly visits from certified therapy animals. Weekly visits, scheduled affection, love by appointment only." As we walked back toward the lobby, David seemed increasingly excited about what we'd seen. "Mom, this is perfect for you," he said, his voice carrying the relief of someone who'd found the solution to a particularly troublesome problem. "Everything you need, all in one place. No more worrying about maintenance or meals or being alone all the time." But I wasn't alone all the time. I had Helen next door, who brought me soup when I had a cold and borrowed my ladder when her gutters needed cleaning. I had Marcus and his family, who let me babysit sometimes when they needed a date night. I had Marie at the salon, who'd been cutting my hair for 15 years and knew all the neighborhood gossip. I had Dr. Patterson, who remembered that I preferred morning appointments and always asked about my garden. Here, I'd have Jennifer's relentless cheer and scheduled activities and people who were my age but nothing else. I'd have safety and convenience and meals I didn't choose, served at times I didn't set, in a place that looked like every other place designed to warehouse the elderly until they could be moved to the next level of care. "What do you think, Mrs. Henderson?" Jennifer asked as we returned to the lobby. "Are you ready to join our Sunset Manor family?" Family. The word felt like a mockery. Families didn't charge monthly fees for the privilege of belonging. Families didn't have visiting hours and activity schedules. Families didn't make you give up everything that made you feel like yourself in exchange for the illusion of safety. "I need to think about it," I said, which was the polite way of saying that I'd rather live in my car than spend my remaining years being managed by strangers who confused care with control. David's face fell slightly, and I could see Amanda's disappointment even though she'd stayed in the car. They'd expected this tour to close the deal, to overwhelm me with the facility's obvious advantages, until I gratefully agreed to pack up my life and move into their neat, beige solution to my inconvenient existence. On the drive home, David tried a different approach. "Mom, I know it's a big decision, but you have to admit, it would give you peace of mind. No more worrying about the house, no more being alone. I like being alone sometimes," I said quietly. "I like having my own space, making my own choices about what to eat and when to eat it. I like playing piano at midnight if I can't sleep, and I like having a garden where I can grow what I want instead of looking at someone else's landscaping. But Mom, what if something happens to you? What if you fall or have a medical emergency, or what if I live?" I interrupted, surprising myself with the sharpness in my voice. "What if I have 10 or 15 or 20 more good years, and I spend them all warehoused in a place where my biggest decision is whether to attend watercolor class or bingo?" David was quiet for the rest of the drive, and I knew I'd disappointed him, not just by rejecting his solution, but by refusing to play the role he'd assigned me, the grateful elderly mother who recognized her limitations and gracefully accepted the arrangements her loving son had made for her benefit. But as we pulled into my driveway, as I saw Harold's roses blooming beside the front porch and noticed that the neighbor's cat was napping in my flower bed again, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, the fierce satisfaction of still having something worth fighting for. That evening, David didn't come by. Neither did Amanda. For the first time in weeks, I ate dinner alone at my kitchen table, a simple meal of scrambled eggs and toast that tasted better than any of the institutional cuisine I'd sampled at Sunset Manor. The silence wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. No one was watching me eat, timing my pace, or suggesting that perhaps I'd be more comfortable in the dining room with people my own age. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning I found David in my driveway before 8 o'clock, not knocking on the door but standing beside his car with his phone pressed to his ear. Through my kitchen window I could see him pacing, gesturing with his free hand in the sharp, frustrated movements I remembered from his teenage years when things didn't go his way. When he finally came to the door, his smile was strained around the edges. "Morning, Mom. I brought coffee." He held up a cardboard cup from the expensive place downtown, the kind of gesture that was supposed to soften whatever blow was coming. "Can we talk?" I let him in, though something in his manner made my chest tighten with dread. He sat at the kitchen table, but he didn't drink the coffee he'd brought me. Instead, he stared at it as if it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "Amanda and I had a long conversation last night," he began, and I knew immediately that whatever they'd discussed, it hadn't been about my well-being. "We've been thinking about timeline expectations." Timeline expectations. The language was getting more clinical, more distant. I was no longer his mother making a difficult decision. I was a project with deadlines that needed to be managed. "We really need to know your plans, Mom. The housing market is competitive right now, and if we're going to make an offer on a place that works for our family, we need to know when this house will be available." Available. As if my home was a vacation rental with checkout times and availability calendars. "David," I said carefully, "I told you I needed time to think about Sunset Manor. It's been less than 24 hours. I know, and I understand that this is hard for you, but Amanda is pregnant." The words hit me like a physical blow. Pregnant. My son was going to be a father, and instead of joy, my first emotion was a bitter recognition that this wasn't news being shared. It was ammunition being deployed. "Congratulations," I managed, and I meant it, despite everything. A grandchild. Harold would have been so excited. "When is the baby due?" January, which is why we need to get settled somewhere larger before Amanda starts showing too much. Moving while pregnant isn't ideal, and we really can't wait much longer to make our housing decisions. Our housing decisions, not my housing decisions, theirs. As if my future was just a variable in their equation, a problem to be solved so they could get on with their real life. I see, I said, though I was beginning to see far more than David realized. Look, Mom, I know Sunset Manor felt overwhelming yesterday, but they have a waiting list, and if we don't move fast, you might lose the opportunity. And honestly, with a baby coming, Amanda and I really need to know that you're settled somewhere safe, where people are looking out for you. Safe. Where people were looking out for me. Not where I was happy, or fulfilled, or maintaining the independence I'd fought for my entire adult life. Just safe. Like a valuable object that needed proper storage. Have you considered, I said slowly, that I might want to be involved in my grandchild's life? That maybe I'd like to be the grandmother who lives close enough to babysit, to help out when you need it, to be part of this child's daily world, instead of the old lady they visit occasionally at the nursing home? David's expression shifted, a flash of something that might have been guilt before his features hardened into the patient look he used when explaining complex concepts to people he considered less informed. Mom, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're thinking emotionally instead of practically. A newborn is a lot of work. The last thing Amanda needs is to feel obligated to include you in childcare when she's already going to be overwhelmed. Obligated to include me in the care of my own grandchild. I stood up from the table, needing to move, needing to do something with the rage that was building in my chest like steam in a kettle. I walked to the window, looking out at Harold's roses, focusing on their stubborn beauty while I fought for control of my voice. What you're telling me, I said without turning around, is that my grandchild would be better off with hired babysitters than with their own grandmother. I'm telling you that Amanda and I need space to figure out parenting without feeling like we're being watched and judged by someone who thinks she knows better because she raised one child 40 years ago. 40 years ago. As if my experience was ancient history, irrelevant to modern life. As if the child I'd raised, the man sitting in my kitchen demanding I abandon my home, wasn't proof that maybe, just maybe, I'd known what I was doing. I turned back to face him, and for a moment, we stared at each other across a divide that felt wider than the few feet of linoleum between us. David, I said quietly, do you remember when you were 7 and you broke your arm falling off your bike? His brow furrowed with confusion. What does that have to do with anything? You remember how scared you were at the hospital? How you wouldn't let anyone else hold your hand during the x-rays? Mom, I don't see... Do you remember what I told you while we waited for the doctor to set your arm? He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him reluctantly accessing that memory, the scared little boy he'd been before he learned to measure love in terms of convenience. You said that sometimes the things that help us heal hurt worse than the original injury, he said finally. That's right. And I told you that the people who love you most are the ones who'll hold your hand through the pain, not the ones who'll take the easy way out. I walked back to the table, sat down across from my son, and looked into eyes that were Harold's eyes, but somehow emptier than I remembered them being. What you're asking me to do, I continued, is the easy way out. For you. You want me to solve your housing problem by disappearing into an institution where you can visit me when it's convenient and forget about me when it's not. That's not fair, Mom. I'm trying to make sure you're taken care of. No, David. You're trying to make sure I'm taken care of by someone else, so you don't have to worry about it. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet I'd enjoyed the night before. This silence was full of truths neither of us wanted to face. That my son had learned to confuse love with management. That he'd somehow convinced himself that abandoning me was actually kindness. That the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him was now standing in the way of his happiness. You have until the end of the week, he said finally, his voice flat and businesslike. Amanda and I need an answer by Friday so we can move forward with our plans. An ultimatum, delivered in my own kitchen, by the child I'd rocked to sleep for the first 3 years of his life. And if my answer isn't what you want to hear, then we'll have to explore other options. Other options. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If I didn't cooperate, if I didn't gracefully accept exile to Sunset Manor, he'd find other ways to get what he needed. Legal ways, probably. Financial ways. Ways that would make my current situation seem generous by comparison. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the untouched coffee he'd brought as a peace offering. The expensive cup had gone cold, the foam heart some barista had drawn in the milk dissolving into meaningless swirls. I thought about the 7-year-old boy with the broken arm, how he'd clung to my hand like I was the only thing standing between him and unbearable pain. I thought about the teenager who'd come home from his first heartbreak and sobbed against my shoulder while I stroked his hair and told him that someday he'd find someone who deserved his love. I thought about the young man who'd called me every Sunday during college, who'd brought his girlfriends home for my approval, who'd asked my advice about everything from job interviews to mortgage applications. When had I stopped being the person he turned to for wisdom and become the problem he needed to solve? I walked through my house that afternoon like a woman saying goodbye, touching surfaces I'd polished thousands of times, standing in doorways I'd passed through for decades. The crack in the bathroom tile that Harold had always meant to fix but never got around to. The scuff marks on the kitchen floor where I'd dragged chairs back from the table after countless family dinners. The height marks on the door frame where we'd measured David's growth every birthday until he got too cool for such things. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of my entire adult life, the witness to every joy and sorrow, every ordinary Tuesday and every special celebration. And David wanted me to walk away from it as casually as checking out of a hotel. But as I stood in Harold's study, surrounded by his books and the photos of our life together, I realized something that David hadn't counted on when he issued his ultimatum. He'd forgotten that I was the woman who'd raised him to be strong, to fight for what mattered, to never give up when things got difficult. He'd somehow convinced himself that becoming a widow had made me weak, that grief had turned me into someone who'd accept whatever scraps of dignity he was willing to offer. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. They didn't know about the strength that comes from 68 years of surviving whatever life throws at you, about the wisdom that comes from watching people you love make terrible mistakes and learning when to save them and when to let them face the consequences. They didn't know that their ultimatum hadn't broken my spirit. It had awakened something in me that I'd forgotten I possessed. That night, I climbed into the attic for the first time since Harold's funeral. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight, but it held steady, just like everything else in this house that David was so eager to declare falling apart. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I made my way toward the far corner, where I'd stored something I hadn't thought about in years. The metal file box sat exactly where I'd left it, under Harold's college textbooks and my old sewing machine. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, not from age or infirmity, but from the weight of what I was about to confront. Inside were documents I'd hoped never to need again. Insurance papers, property deeds, bank statements, all the financial architecture of a life carefully built over decades. But beneath those mundane necessities lay something David had never known about, something I'd kept private even from Harold in the early years of our marriage, the inheritance from my Aunt Dorothy. Dorothy had been my father's youngest sister, a spinster who'd worked as a secretary for 40 years and lived so frugally that everyone assumed she'd die as poor as she'd lived. But Dorothy had been investing her modest paycheck since the 1940s, buying small amounts of stock in companies she believed in and holding on to them through decades of market ups and downs. She'd left everything to me, her favorite niece who'd always sent Christmas cards and remembered birthdays, with one condition: I was never to tell anyone about the inheritance, unless it was absolutely necessary for my independence. Don't let any man, even a good one, make decisions about this money, she'd written in the letter that accompanied her will. Keep it for yourself, for when you need to remember that you don't need anyone's permission to live your own life. At the time, I'd thought her advice was old-fashioned, even bitter. Harold and I had been newlyweds then, madly in love, and convinced that partnership meant sharing everything. I'd almost told him about the money a dozen times, but something always held me back. Dorothy's fierce independence, perhaps, or maybe some instinct I didn't understand yet. Over the years, I'd forgotten about it entirely, letting the investment sit untouched while Harold and I built our life on his salary and my small earnings from part-time work. The account statements came quarterly, filed away automatically without much attention. It wasn't until after Harold's death, when I was going through our finances, that I'd realized what Dorothy's careful investing had become: nearly $500,000, enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, to hire help when I needed it, to maintain my house properly, to remain independent until the day I died, enough to make David's concerns about my financial security irrelevant. If only he knew it existed. But I'd kept Dorothy's secret for 45 years, and sitting in the dusty attic with the account statements in my hands, I finally understood why she'd made me promise. Independence wasn't just about having money, it was about having choices. And the moment other people knew about your resources, they started making your choices for you, packaging their own desires as concern for your welfare. I thought about Harold, how he might have reacted if he'd known about the money. Would he have insisted we use it for a bigger house, a better car, college savings for David? Would he have made careful, loving plans that gradually eroded my autonomy in the name of our shared future? I'd never know, and it didn't matter now. What mattered was that David saw me as a burden, a problem to be solved, an old woman whose dwindling resources made her dependent on his goodwill. He'd calculated my worth based on what he could see, my modest widow's pension, the equity in a house that needed maintenance, and found me wanting. He had no idea that I could buy Sunset Manor if I wanted to, that I could hire a live-in companion or a full-time housekeeper, that I could travel the world or renovate my home or donate enough money to a charity to have a wing named after Harold and me. But more importantly, he had no idea that I'd rather live under a bridge than accept help from someone who saw my love as obligation and my presence as inconvenience. I climbed down from the attic and made myself a cup of tea, sitting at my kitchen table with Dorothy's legacy spread before me like a hand of cards I'd been waiting 45 years to play. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its evening rhythm, porch lights coming on, dinner smells drifting from open windows, the sound of children being called inside for baths and bedtime stories, normal family life, continuing all around me while I planned my escape from the family that no longer wanted me. The next morning, I called my lawyer, not the family attorney who'd handled Harold's will, but Dorothy's old lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been managing the investment account since Dorothy's death. I'd spoken to her exactly once, at the reading of Dorothy's will, but she remembered me immediately. "Mrs. Henderson," she said when I identified myself. "It's been quite some time. I hope you're calling because you're finally ready to take advantage of your aunt's generosity." "I think I am," I said. "But first, I need to understand something. If I wanted to remain completely independent, to ensure that no one could force me into living arrangements I didn't choose, what would that require?" "Are you in some kind of legal trouble?" Sarah asked, her voice sharpening with professional concern. "Not legal trouble exactly, family trouble." There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her tone was gentler. "Ah, I see. You know, your Aunt Dorothy faced something similar with her own family near the end of her life. Her nephew kept pressuring her to move in with his family, ostensibly for her own good. She used to say that good intentions were just manipulation with better marketing. What did she do? She made sure she had choices, legal, financial, medical. She put systems in place that guaranteed no one else could make decisions about her life without her explicit consent. Would you like to explore some of those options?" For the first time in weeks, I felt something that might have been hope. Yes, I would. We talked for over an hour, Sarah explaining the legal tools available to someone who wanted to protect their independence while ensuring their own care. Living wills that specified exactly what kind of medical intervention I wanted. Durable power of attorney documents that could be revoked if misused. Financial structures that would provide for my care while keeping control firmly in my hands. "The beautiful thing about having resources," Sarah said, "is that it gives you the power to reward the people who genuinely care about you and shut out the ones who don't." After I hung up the phone, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking about David and Amanda and the grandchild who was coming. I thought about the son who'd forgotten how to love without conditions, who'd learned to measure relationships in terms of convenience and burden. I thought about Harold, who'd never know his grandchild, but who would have understood immediately why I couldn't let our son trade my independence for his comfort. And I thought about Dorothy, who'd died alone but free, who'd left me not just money but wisdom about the difference between solitude and abandonment, between independence and isolation. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. David wanted my house, my compliance, my grateful acceptance of whatever arrangements he made for my future. He wanted me to be a problem with a solution, an obligation with an expiration date, a mother whose love came without the inconvenience of her actual presence. But I had choices he didn't know about. resources he couldn't access, and nearly 7 decades of experience in surviving whatever life threw at me. Friday was still 3 days away. David expected an answer by then. My surrender disguised as acceptance, my exile packaged as a new beginning. He was going to get an answer, all right, just not the one he was expecting. I picked up the phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number again. Sarah? It's Margaret Henderson. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I believe it's time to honor my aunt's memory properly. I'd like to set up a meeting to discuss some significant changes to my living situation. I'm delighted to hear it, Margaret. When would you like to come in? Tomorrow morning, if possible. I have some plans to make, and I don't think I should wait much longer. Of course. And Margaret, your aunt would be very proud. After I hung up, I walked through my house one more time. But this walk felt different from the melancholy tour I'd taken the day before. This time, I wasn't saying goodbye to my home. I was saying hello to possibilities I'd forgotten I had. The house was mine. The choices were mine. The future was mine to write. And I was done letting other people hold the pen. David had given me an ultimatum, thinking it would force me into compliance. Instead, he'd set me free. Thursday morning arrived with unusual purpose. I dressed carefully, not in the casual clothes of a woman who'd given up, but in the navy blazer and pearls I'd worn to important occasions throughout my marriage. If I was going to take control of my life, I wanted to look like someone who deserved respect. Sarah Chen's office was in the historic district downtown, in a renovated Victorian house that managed to feel both professional and welcoming. Sarah herself was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with intelligent eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd dealt with plenty of families who confused love with control. Margaret, she said, rising from behind a desk covered with neat stacks of documents. I'm so glad you called. Your Aunt Dorothy spoke of you often during our meetings. She'd be thrilled to know you're finally ready to claim your independence. We spent 2 hours going through options I'd never known existed. Legal documents that would ensure my medical decisions remained mine alone. Financial structures that would provide excellent care while keeping David's hands, and his good intentions, away from my resources. Most importantly, a plan that would allow me to age gracefully in my own home, with professional help when I needed it, without surrendering my autonomy to anyone who thought they knew better. The key, Sarah explained, is setting everything up before anyone realizes you need to protect yourself. Once family members start legal proceedings, claiming you're incompetent or unable to make decisions, it becomes much harder to maintain control. Is that something David might do? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. It's something many adult children do when they convince themselves that their parents' resistance to their plans is evidence of diminished capacity, Sarah said diplomatically. Love makes people do terrible things sometimes, especially when they confuse helping with controlling. By the time I left her office, I had a plan that would have made Dorothy proud. My finances restructured to provide maximum independence. A team of professionals, geriatric care manager, housekeeping service, handyman, ready to help me maintain my home and my dignity. Legal protections that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to force me into living arrangements I didn't choose. Most importantly, I had a timeline. Everything would be in place by Friday afternoon, just hours before David's deadline. Thursday evening, I cooked Harold's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes. The recipe I'd made so many times I could prepare it blindfolded. Not because I was feeling nostalgic, but because I wanted to remind myself what love actually looked like. Love was learning someone's preferences and honoring them. Love was showing up consistently, day after day, without keeping score. Love was sacrifice that didn't demand gratitude, care that didn't require compliance. Harold had loved me that way for 37 years. He'd never once suggested I was too much trouble, too set in my ways, too inconveniently present in his life. As I ate dinner alone at my kitchen table, a meal that tasted like memory and hope combined, I heard a car in the driveway. David, arriving for what he probably thought would be another pressure session, disguised as caring conversation. But when he knocked, I didn't hurry to answer. I finished my dinner at my own pace, cleaned my dishes properly, and only then walked to the front door. Through the glass, I could see him checking his watch with the impatience of someone whose schedule was being disrupted by an inconsiderate old woman. "Evening, David," I said when I finally opened the door. "This is unexpected." "Hi, Mom. I know I said Friday, but I wanted to check in, see how you're doing with everything." He stepped inside without being invited, a habit that had developed over the past few weeks as he'd grown more comfortable treating my home as his future property. "I'm doing very well, actually. Better than I have in weeks." Something in my tone must have caught his attention, because he looked at me more closely. "You seem different tonight." "Do I?" I led him into the living room, where I'd arranged some of Dorothy's investment statements on the coffee table. Not obviously, but visible enough that he might notice if he was paying attention. "I suppose I feel more like myself than I have lately." David settled into Harold's chair again, but this time I remained standing. A small shift in dynamics that made him look up at me with something that might have been confusion. "Mom, about tomorrow's conversation." "What conversation is that, David?" "Your decision. About Sunset Manor. Amanda and I really need to know your plans so we can move forward with ours." "Ah, yes. My decision." I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Harold's roses were still blooming despite being neglected for weeks. "Tell me something, David. When did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as an obstacle to your happiness?" "Mom, that's not fair. Everything I'm doing is for your own good." "Is it?" I turned back to face him, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the full power of my own presence. "Or is it for yours? I don't understand what you're getting at." "I think you do. You want this house, David. You want me safely stored somewhere you don't have to think about me very often. You want to start your family without the inconvenience of dealing with the woman who sacrificed everything to raise you." His face flushed red. "That's not true, and it's not fair. I'm trying to help you. By taking away my home, by dismissing my preferences, by giving me ultimatums in my own kitchen, by making sure you're safe and cared for." "Safe from what exactly? From making my own choices? From living my own life? From being anything other than a grateful, compliant old woman who knows her place?" David stood up abruptly, his patience finally exhausted. "Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. This house is too big for you. You're getting older, whether you admit it or not, and something's going to happen eventually. And when it does, when you fall down these stairs or have a stroke alone in your bedroom, guess who's going to get the call? Guess who's going to drop everything to deal with the emergency you could have prevented by making smarter choices now? And that's what this is really about, isn't it?" I said quietly. "Not my safety, your convenience. It's about being realistic. It's about you wanting to control my life so you don't have to worry about it interfering with yours." The silence that followed was thick with truths we'd both been avoiding. David stared at me as if seeing a stranger, and perhaps he was. Perhaps he'd grown so accustomed to thinking of me as a problem to be solved that he'd forgotten I was a person with thoughts and feelings and rights that existed independent of his comfort level. "You know what, Mom?" he said finally, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "Maybe Amanda was right. Maybe you are too stubborn and selfish to accept help when it's offered." "Amanda said that about me?" "She said you seemed determined to make things difficult for everyone, and maybe I should just let you deal with the consequences of your choices." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how completely I'd been transformed in their minds from Harold's beloved wife and David's devoted mother into an inconvenient old woman whose feelings didn't matter as much as their plans. "I see," I said, and I did see. I saw that this wasn't about love anymore, if it ever had been. It was about possession and control, and the casual cruelty that people convince themselves is kindness when it serves their purposes. "Tomorrow's Friday, Mom," David said, heading for the door. "Amanda and I need an answer. A real answer. Not more stalling and manipulation. Manipulation." The accusation was so perfectly ironic that I almost laughed. He was taking my house, threatening my independence, and pressuring me to accept exile to a facility I'd never chosen. But I was the one being manipulative for wanting time to consider my options. After he left, I sat in the living room for a long time, not feeling sorry for myself, but marveling at how completely the situation had clarified itself. There was no compromise to be reached, no middle ground to be found. David and Amanda wanted what they wanted, and my preferences were simply obstacles to be overcome. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that being a widow made me weak, that grief had made me compliant, that my love for them would make me sacrifice everything to avoid conflict. They'd forgotten that I was Dorothy's niece, Harold's equal partner, and David's mother, a woman who'd spent 68 years learning how to survive and thrive in a world that constantly underestimated her. Friday morning, I made one final phone call to Sarah Chen. "Everything's ready on this end, Margaret," she said. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "Good. Your aunt would be so proud. You're about to show them exactly what independence looks like." I hung up the phone and looked around my kitchen one more time, not with sadness, but with satisfaction. Whatever happened next, I'd face it on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my choices firmly in my own hands. David wanted an answer by the end of the day. He was going to get one that would change everything. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem sharper, more defined. I spent the morning in my garden, cutting the last roses of the season, Harold's roses, still blooming despite everyone's assumption that I couldn't maintain them properly. I arranged them in the crystal vase we'd received as a wedding gift, placing them on the dining room table where David and Amanda would see them when they arrived. A small reminder of what love looked like when it was patient and enduring, when it bloomed year after year without demanding anything in return except basic care and attention. At 2 o'clock, I heard their car in the driveway. Through the window, I watched them sit for a moment, probably steeling themselves for what they assumed would be a difficult conversation with a stubborn old woman who didn't know what was best for her. David straightened his tie, that nervous habit again, while Amanda checked her makeup in the passenger mirror. They had no idea they were about to walk into an entirely different conversation than the one they'd planned. I opened the door before they could knock, greeting them with a smile that was genuinely warm for the first time in weeks. "David, Amanda, please come in. I've made coffee." They exchanged that look again, the wordless communication of people who thought they understood the situation they were walking into. Amanda was carrying a manila folder, probably filled with Sunset Manor brochures and application forms, ready to help me fill out paperwork once I accepted the inevitable. "You seem cheerful today, Mom," David said cautiously as they settled into the living room. "I hope that means you've had time to think clearly about your options." "Oh, I have," I assured him, pouring coffee from the good china service, another wedding gift that had survived 45 years of daily use and careful tending. "I've thought very clearly about many things this week." Amanda leaned forward eagerly. "We brought some additional information about Sunset Manor," she said, opening her folder. "There are some wonderful photos of the gardens, and we found out they have a waiting list for the nicer apartments, so if we move quickly—" "Amanda," I interrupted gently, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I have something I need to tell both of you before we discuss any plans." Something in my tone must have registered, because David set down his coffee cup and gave me his full attention for the first time in weeks. "I've made some decisions about my future," I continued, settling into my own chair with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Decisions that might surprise you. Mom, if you've decided to be reasonable about Sunset Manor," David began. "No, David. I've decided to be reasonable about my life, my choices, my independence." I reached for the folder I'd prepared, pulling out the documents Sarah Chen had helped me organize. "You see, there are some things about my financial situation that you don't know, things I've kept private, because I believed family members should trust each other's judgment about important decisions." David's eyes narrowed slightly as he tried to read the papers I was arranging on the coffee table. "What kind of things?" "The kind that make your concerns about my ability to maintain this house and support myself completely unnecessary." I handed him the investment summary Sarah had prepared, a clean, professional document that laid out Dorothy's legacy in terms even a financial advisor would respect. The silence that followed was profound. I watched David's face change as he processed the numbers, saw Amanda lean over to read the figures that transformed me from a burden into something else entirely. "This is—" David started, then stopped, clearly struggling to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about my circumstances. "Nearly $500,000, I finished calmly. "From my Aunt Dorothy, invested carefully over the past 45 years. More than enough to hire whatever help I need, to maintain this house properly, to live independently for the rest of my life without being anyone's financial burden." Amanda was staring at the papers as if they might disappear if she blinked. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't understand. If you have this much money, why didn't you say something when we were discussing your situation?" "Because I wanted to understand what your concern was really about," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I wanted to know whether you were worried about my well-being or your own convenience." David's face was cycling through a range of emotions: shock, confusion, and something that might have been embarrassment. "Mom, this changes everything. If you can afford proper care?" "David," I said quietly, "it doesn't change anything that matters." "What do you mean?" "Of course it changes things. You could hire a housekeeper, a cook, even a live-in companion if you wanted. You could renovate the house, update everything that needs fixing. I could do all of those things," I agreed. "And I will do some of them, but not because you think I should, because I choose to." The distinction seemed to escape him entirely. He was already making new plans, recalculating the situation based on resources he hadn't known existed. "This is wonderful news, Mom. We could set up a proper care plan, maybe find you some reliable help, make sure you're safe here. Although, even with money, living alone at your age isn't ideal. Maybe we could find a nice companion, someone who could stay here with you." And there it was. The money hadn't changed his fundamental assumption that I needed to be managed. It had just given him new ideas about how to do it. "David," I said, my voice carrying a steel that made him stop talking and really look at me. "You're still not hearing what I'm telling you." "I'm listening, Mom. I'm trying to understand. You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. You're trying to manage a life that isn't yours to manage." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for decades, where I knew every neighbor and they knew me, where I belonged. Not because anyone had given me permission, but because I'd made it my home through years of daily investment in the simple act of living. "You came here today expecting me to agree to give up my house, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life," I continued, still facing the window. "You thought that because I'm 68 and widowed, I'd be grateful for whatever arrangements you made on my behalf." "Mom, that's not—" "Yes, it is." I turned back to face them, and I could see that Amanda had grown very still, perhaps beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going the way she'd expected. "You assumed that grief had made me weak, that age had made me incompetent, that my love for you would make me compliant." I walked back to my chair, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood behind it, using its presence as a kind of podium from which to deliver the speech I'd been preparing for days. "You forgot that I'm the woman who managed a household budget for 45 years, who raised a child while working part-time, who nursed my husband through his final illness without once complaining about the burden. You forgot that I'm Dorothy's niece, with all the stubbornness and independence that implies." David was starting to look uncomfortable, shifting in his seat like a man who'd walked into the wrong meeting. "But most of all, you forgot that love, real love, doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't require the beloved person to make themselves smaller, more convenient, less present in your life." "Mom, we love you," Amanda said suddenly, her voice smaller than usual. "That's why we want you to be safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. "From living my own life? From making my own mistakes? From existing in a way that doesn't perfectly align with your plans for your future?" I reached for another document from my folder, the care plan Sarah had helped me develop. "I've hired a geriatric care manager," I announced, "a professional who will assess my needs regularly and arrange for whatever services I require. I've also contracted with a housekeeping service, a landscaping company, and a handyman who specializes in maintaining older homes. I have a medical alert system being installed next week, and I've updated all my legal documents to ensure that my wishes about my care will be respected no matter what happens to my health." David was staring at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You did all of this without consulting us?" "I did all of this without needing your permission," I corrected. "Just like you toured Sunset Manor without consulting me. Just like you made plans for this house without asking what I wanted." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Harold's grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that had marked time in this house for 30 years, that would continue marking time long after this conversation was over. "So here's my answer to your ultimatum," I said finally, my voice calm and clear. "I'm staying in my home. I'm aging in place, with professional support that I choose and control. I'm remaining independent for as long as I'm physically and mentally capable of making that choice." I paused, letting the words settle between us like stones dropped into still water. "And if that interferes with your plans for this house, for your expanding family, for your vision of what my future should look like, then you'll need to make different plans." The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had opened suddenly in the living room floor. David stared at the investment documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense to him. Amanda had gone very still, her folder of Sunset Manor brochures forgotten in her lap. Finally, David spoke, his voice hoarse with something between shock and what might have been shame. "Mom, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us about the money from the beginning? We could have worked together to make plans that respected your independence." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the exact moment when he began to understand what had happened here. Not just the revelation of my financial resources, but the exposure of his own assumptions about my worth, my capacity, my right to self-determination. "Could we have?" I asked gently. "Because from where I sit, it seems like you'd already decided what was best for me before you knew anything about my actual circumstances." "That's not fair," Amanda said, but her protest lacked conviction. She was beginning to understand that fairness had been absent from this entire situation, just not in the direction she'd assumed. "Isn't it?" I sat down across from them, my posture relaxed now that the hardest part was over. "David, tell me honestly, if I'd shown you these financial statements 3 weeks ago, would you have dropped your plans for this house? Would you have said, 'You're right, Mom. You can afford to stay here and age in place with professional support, so Amanda and I will find our own solution to our housing needs'?" The pause that followed was answer enough. "Or would you have found new reasons why I shouldn't remain here alone? Would you have worried about my mental capacity to manage money, about predatory people taking advantage of my resources, about the burden of maintaining such a large house even with hired help?" David's face flushed with the uncomfortable recognition that comes when someone holds up a mirror to your motivations and you don't like what you see reflected there. "I was trying to protect you," he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "No, sweetheart," I said, and my voice carried all the love I'd felt for him since the moment he was born, tempered now by the sadness of knowing he'd forgotten how to trust it. "You were trying to protect yourself. From worry, from responsibility, from the inconvenience of having a mother who might need support, but refused to surrender control." I reached across the coffee table and took his hand, the same hand I'd held through scraped knees and nightmare tears, through first day of school anxiety and teenage heartbreak. "But here's what you didn't understand," I continued. "I never needed you to manage my life. I needed you to trust that I could manage it myself, with help when I chose to ask for it." Amanda cleared her throat, her voice small when she spoke. "Mrs. Henderson, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your situation that weren't fair. You made assumptions about elderly women in general," I corrected, not unkindly. "That we're burdens waiting to happen, problems to be solved, people whose preferences matter less than other people's convenience." She nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "I was thinking about the baby, about making sure David wasn't torn between caring for you and caring for our family. But I realize now that I was solving a problem that didn't exist, and creating one that didn't need to exist," I added. "Because if you'd simply asked what I needed instead of deciding what I should want, we could have avoided all of this." David was quiet for a long moment, still holding my hand, still processing the reality that his mother had just outmaneuvered him completely while teaching him a lesson about respect and autonomy that he should have learned decades ago. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Between us, I mean. Have I damaged this beyond repair?" The question broke my heart a little, because it showed me that underneath his misguided attempts at control, my son was still the boy who worried about disappointing me, who wanted my approval even when he'd forgotten how to earn it properly. "David," I said, squeezing his hand, "you're going to be a father soon. And if you learn anything from this experience, let it be this. Love doesn't require the person you love to make themselves smaller to fit your plans. It requires you to make space for them to be exactly who they are." I released his hand and stood up, walking to the bookshelf where I kept our family photos. I picked up my favorite, Harold and me with baby David, all of us laughing at something the photographer had said. It had been taken in this very living room 35 years ago. "Your father and I made mistakes raising you," I said, studying the photo. "But one thing we never did was make you feel like your existence was inconvenient. Even when you were colicky as a baby, even when you were impossible as a teenager, even when you made choices we didn't understand, you always belonged in our lives completely." I turned back to face them, the photo still in my hands. That's what I want for my grandchild. To belong completely, without conditions, without having to earn their place by being convenient or manageable or grateful for whatever space is offered to them. And that's what I want for myself, I continued. To belong in my son's life without having to give up my own life to earn that belonging. David stood up then, crossing the room to embrace me with the genuine warmth I remembered from before Amanda, before the house pressure, before he'd started seeing me as a problem instead of a person. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered against my hair. "I lost sight of who you are. I started seeing the situation instead of seeing you. We all make mistakes when we're scared," I said, holding him close. "You're going to be a father, David. That's terrifying and wonderful and overwhelming all at once. But the answer isn't to control everyone else's life to make yours feel more manageable." When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Can you forgive me? Can we start over?" "There's nothing to forgive," I assured him, "but there are new patterns to establish. I want to be part of your family's life. I want to know my grandchild, to babysit when you need help, to share holidays and birthdays and all the ordinary moments that make up a life. But I want to do those things from my own home, as an independent woman who chooses to share her time and love, rather than someone who's grateful for whatever inclusion is offered." Amanda spoke up from the couch, her voice stronger now. "We'd like that too. And Mrs. Henderson? I'd like permission to call you Margaret, or Mom, if that's okay. I think it's time we stopped treating you like a polite stranger." "I'd like that very much," I said, and I meant it. "But only if you promise to remember that being family means respecting each other's autonomy, not trying to manage each other's lives." The afternoon that followed felt like a new beginning. We talked about the baby, my grandchild, and about how I could be involved in meaningful ways that didn't require me to surrender my independence. We discussed holidays and traditions I wanted to continue, and new ones we might create together. David asked to see the care plan I'd developed with Sarah Chen, and I was touched by his genuine interest in understanding how it would work, what kind of support it would provide, how it would adapt as my needs changed over time. "This is actually brilliant," he admitted as he read through the documents. "You've created a system that provides everything Sunset Manor would have offered, but with complete autonomy and in your own home. Your Aunt Dorothy would be proud," Amanda added, after I'd told them about the inheritance and the wisdom that came with it. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman." "She was," I agreed, "and she taught me that independence isn't about not needing help. It's about maintaining the power to choose what kind of help you receive and how you receive it." As evening approached and they prepared to leave, David paused at the front door. "Mom, there's something else I need to say. About what Amanda mentioned the other night, calling you stubborn and selfish. She was wrong, and I was wrong to repeat it. You weren't being difficult. You were being strong." "Sometimes," I said, smiling at both of them, "being strong looks a lot like being stubborn. The difference is in knowing what's worth fighting for." After they left, I walked through my house in the gathering dusk, turning on lamps and drawing curtains against the October chill. Tomorrow, the housekeeping service would start their weekly visits. Next week, the handyman would begin the updates I'd decided to make, not because anyone told me the house was falling apart, but because I wanted to enjoy improvements I could afford and chose for myself. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Harold's chair, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. His books, our photographs, the piano that held my mother's memory, the garden visible through the window where his roses would bloom again next spring. This was my home, and I was staying in it on my own terms. My son was going to be a father, and I was going to be a grandmother, roles we'd both learned to approach with greater wisdom and respect. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but entirely my own to shape. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth, and sometimes the quietest revolution is simply a woman refusing to disappear when the world has decided she's no longer convenient. I raised my teacup in a toast to Harold, to Dorothy, to all the women who'd fought for dignity and won, and to all the ones still fighting. Then I picked up my book and began to read, in my own house, in my own chair, in the life I'd chosen to keep.